In every quiet suburban neighborhood, there's always one person who takes things just a little too seriously. For the residents of Maplewood Estates, that person was Karen Phillips, the self-appointed enforcer of HOA rules and the self-proclaimed neighborhood standards coordinator. She wasn't elected, but she acted like she had been. Clipboards, measuring tapes, and printed rulebooks followed her everywhere she went. The story began in the first week of December, when the early evening air carried the faint scent of pine and cinnamon, and houses began to glow with the soft twinkle of Christmas lights. Families strung decorations, children laughed, and for a brief moment, the world felt warm and bright. Everyone looked forward to the holidays. Everyone except Karen. The narrator of this story, a man named Daniel, had just moved into Maplewood the previous summer. A quiet man with a love for DIY projects, Daniel saw the neighborhood's upcoming holiday decoration contest as the perfect way to meet people and add some festive cheer. He spent days carefully outlining his roof with lights, setting up glowing reindeer on the lawn, and building a handcrafted sleigh that looked straight out of a Christmas movie. It was elegant, tasteful, and cheerful, exactly what the neighborhood needed. But to Karen, it was a violation waiting to happen. 3 days after Daniel finished his setup, he found a bright yellow notice taped to his mailbox. It was from the HOA. The letter stated that his excessive illumination and unauthorized lawn structures were in violation of community regulations. The fine was $250, with an additional $50 per day if not removed. At the bottom of the letter was a signature, Karen Phillips, acting compliance officer. Daniel couldn't believe it. He had checked the HOA rules before decorating. The guidelines said nothing about light limits or lawn ornaments. It was clear this wasn't about the rules. It was about control. Still, he decided to play it calm. He took photos, documented everything, and politely emailed the HOA board requesting clarification. Days passed. No reply. Then another notice appeared, this time claiming that his decorations were a safety hazard due to potential electrical overload. Another fine. Another signature from Karen. It became obvious that this wasn't just about lights. Karen had made him her holiday target. Neighbors began whispering, sharing their own stories of Karen's petty crusades. One woman recalled being fined for having her trash can out for 3 minutes too long. Another man was forced to repaint his shed because Karen claimed the color wasn't neutral enough. Daniel realized what was happening. Karen wasn't enforcing community standards. She was enforcing her version of perfection. And this time, she had picked the wrong person to push around. That night, Daniel sat in his garage surrounded by extension cords, timers, and light strands. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was calculating. If Karen wanted to play the rulebook game, he'd play by the book and win. He spent hours reading every line of the HOA's official document. He found contradictions, outdated clauses, and vague wording. Nowhere did it mention a restriction on light brightness, display size, or timing, as long as decorations were taken down by January 10th. That gave him exactly 35 days. He decided that if Karen wanted a problem, he'd give her a spectacular one. Not a small protest, not a quiet objection, a statement so bright it would be impossible to ignore. He began planning his masterpiece, an entire synchronized light show covering not just his house, but extending across his property line with precision-timed music and color patterns. He wanted something that would draw attention, not just from the HOA, but from the entire town. Over the next week, his driveway filled with boxes from delivery trucks, LED light strips, smart controllers, a portable generator, and even a small FM transmitter. Neighbors began to notice the activity. Some were curious, some amused, and a few offered to help. Word spread quickly. Daniel was planning something big. Karen, of course, was watching too. Every afternoon, she'd stroll by with her clipboard, pretending to walk her dog while snapping photos of Daniel's progress. She sent another letter, warning him that continued defiance could lead to legal escalation. Daniel filed it away with the others. He wasn't breaking any laws, not yet. By mid-December, the project was complete. Miles of lights wound across the roof, yard, and fence. Hidden speakers lined the bushes. When night came, Daniel tested the system, and the neighborhood erupted in applause. The entire house danced to synchronized holiday music, perfectly timed to every beat. It was stunning, dazzling, and completely legal. Karen lost it. She called the HOA board, the county, and even the local police, claiming Daniel's lights were a public disturbance. But when officers arrived, they found nothing in violation. The lights turned off at 10 p.m., exactly within the city's noise ordinance. The officers smiled, wished Daniel Merry Christmas, and drove off. Karen stood speechless, clutching her clipboard in defeat as the neighborhood cheered. But Daniel wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. He had plans to make the show even bigger, and soon it would grow beyond their little neighborhood. What started as one man's Christmas display was about to become a community-wide event and Karen's personal nightmare. The first night of Daniel's grand display had been a success, too much of one for Karen's liking. The sight of hundreds of twinkling lights shimmering in perfect harmony with Christmas music filled the air with joy. Cars slowed down to watch, children pointed in awe, and families took photos in front of Daniel's house. The light show became the centerpiece of Maplewood Estates almost overnight. But with every cheer that echoed through the cold December air, Karen's frustration grew. She had spent years molding the neighborhood into what she considered orderly perfection. And now, this spectacle, this carnival of colors and laughter, had thrown her power into question. The morning after the debut, Karen launched a campaign. She began by calling an emergency HOA board meeting. Though the board wasn't required to act on every complaint, Karen had a knack for stirring panic. She described Daniel's display as a blinding hazard, a traffic threat, and a potential fire risk. She sent emails filled with photos taken at odd angles to make the lights seem more chaotic than they were. She demanded immediate fines and removal. But the HOA board, now under pressure from dozens of positive messages from other residents, refused to act hastily. Some even praised Daniel for bringing joy to the neighborhood. Karen was furious. She realized if she couldn't control the board, she'd have to control the narrative herself. She began leaving flyers on doorsteps, warning residents about electrical dangers and increased energy costs due to power surges. She even claimed the light show could attract criminals. The absurdity of it all might have been funny if it weren't so persistent. Meanwhile, Daniel continued expanding the show. He added sequences for new songs, everything from Jingle Bell Rock to Carol of the Bells. He integrated motion sensors so the lights reacted to people walking by, creating interactive effects that made children laugh and clap. But Daniel wasn't doing it out of spite. Deep down, he wanted to show that the holidays could bring people together. He began setting up a donation box near the sidewalk, labeled Lights for Good. All proceeds go to the local shelter. Within days, the box overflowed with donations. What started as a neighborhood project had turned into a small charity movement. The local newspaper caught wind of it next. A reporter visited, took photos, and published a story titled, "One Man's Christmas Lights Bring Community Together." The article praised Daniel's creativity, noting how families from other neighborhoods were driving in just to see the display. Karen saw the article that same morning and nearly exploded with anger. To her, it wasn't just about the lights anymore. It was about losing control. She stormed into the HOA office, demanding they take decisive action. When that didn't work, she took matters into her own hands. She began documenting every minor thing she could twist into a violation. Garbage cans an inch too close to the curb, a loose extension cord, even footprints on Daniel's lawn left by visitors. She compiled it all into a 12-page complaint, printed in bold, and mailed it not just to the HOA but to the County Code Enforcement Office. Days later, Daniel received an official letter from the county. A complaint had been filed regarding possible electrical safety concerns and excessive outdoor lighting. Inspectors would visit within the week. Most people would have panicked. Daniel didn't. He had already ensured everything was within regulation, every cord certified, every connection properly grounded. When the inspectors arrived, they found nothing wrong. They even complimented his setup, noting it was safer than most holiday displays they'd seen. Karen's campaign was starting to backfire. Residents were growing tired of her constant complaints. Children whispered jokes about the Grinch lady, and parents exchanged amused glances whenever she passed by. Even the HOA board began ignoring her emails. But Karen wasn't finished. She decided to escalate things one more time. Late one night, under the dim streetlights, she crept to the edge of Daniel's property and took new photos. This time, close-ups that made it look like his lights were crossing onto public land. She sent the photos to a local Facebook group, captioned with, "When one selfish neighbor ruins Christmas for everyone else." What she didn't expect was how quickly the community would turn against her. The post went viral, but not in the way she hoped. Comment after comment called her out for pettiness and jealousy. Some even uploaded videos showing how beautiful Daniel's lights were, countering her accusations in real time. Daniel, however, stayed silent. He didn't respond to the drama. Instead, he doubled down on kindness. The next evening, he added a giant glowing sign in his yard that read, "Merry Christmas, Maplewood. Let's keep it bright." It wasn't directed at Karen by name, but everyone knew who it was meant for. The following week, cars began lining up around the block. Local news channels covered the story, and one anchor described it as the brightest house in town, shining with holiday spirit and defying the darkness of petty rules. Donations skyrocketed, and Daniel's display became the most talked-about attraction in the area. But for Karen, each passing night felt like a personal defeat. The lights reflected in her windows, seeping into her perfectly curated living room. She tried closing her blinds, but the glow still reached her, a constant reminder that she had lost control of her kingdom. And in that frustration, something in her snapped. As Christmas Eve approached, Karen began planning her next move, something that would ensure Daniel's display came down once and for all. What she didn't realize was that her plan would not only fail, but would expose her in front of the entire neighborhood. By the week before Christmas, Maplewood Estates had transformed into something out of a postcard. Every evening, the streets filled with the soft hum of idling cars as visitors slowly drove by to see Daniel's now famous light show. Children pressed their faces against frosted windows. Music played through the FM station Daniel had set up, and the air carried a kind of magic the neighborhood had never felt before. Everyone seemed touched by the glow. Everyone except Karen. Her once proud house, perched directly across from Daniel's, now sat in shadow. She refused to hang a single decoration. Her curtain stayed closed, her front porch dark. While others laughed outside, Karen stayed inside, fuming in the dim light of her kitchen. The flickering colors reflecting through her blinds seemed to mock her every time she looked out. For Karen, this had stopped being about HOA rules weeks ago. It was personal now, a matter of pride. She saw Daniel's defiance as a direct challenge to her authority, a spotlight shining on her failure to control the community she had once dominated. She spent her days on the phone, calling anyone she thought might take her side. The HOA ignored her. The city dismissed her complaints. Even the fire department, which she had called just in case, confirmed the setup was safe. Her influence had evaporated. Then one night, something inside her snapped. Around 11 p.m., as the final song of Daniel's synchronized display faded into silence and the lights clicked off for the night, Karen sat at her dining table, staring at a stack of HOA papers and past warning letters. Her reflection in the window was lit by the faint red and green afterglow of Daniel's display shutting down. Her face was tense, eyes burning with resentment. If no one else would act, she told herself she would. She waited until well after midnight, when the neighborhood was silent and blanketed in stillness. She dressed in black, pulled on a heavy coat, and slipped out her back door with a flashlight and a pair of wire cutters. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she crept down the sidewalk toward Daniel's property. Every step was filled with a strange, vengeful satisfaction. She convinced herself she was restoring order, that she was doing what others were too cowardly to do. Daniel's house loomed ahead, dark now except for the faint glow of the timers and controllers tucked beside the garage. She moved quickly, crouching near the main extension cord that fed power to the entire system. The plug connected to a grounded outlet protected by a waterproof cover. Karen yanked it open, muttering to herself, and with one sharp tug, she pulled the plug free. Instantly, the faint hum of electronic equipment ceased. For the first time in weeks, the property was dark, completely dark. No glow, no music, no life. Karen smiled. For a moment, she felt powerful again. Victorious. She hurried home, heart pounding, already imagining the smug satisfaction she'd feel when the neighborhood woke up to silence. But her victory didn't last long. The next morning, Daniel came outside early to inspect his setup before work. He quickly noticed the unplugged cords and the muddy footprints near the control box. His cameras, small, nearly invisible ones installed for security, had caught everything. Every step, every movement. Karen's face. Daniel didn't rush to the police. He didn't even tell the HOA. Instead, he did something Karen could never have expected. He smiled, because this, he realized, was the final piece he needed. That afternoon, Daniel quietly reconnected everything and ran a test. The lights came back to life without issue. Then he made a small adjustment to his system, a backup generator and a secured outlet inside his garage, unreachable from the outside. This time, no one could shut him down. When evening came, the show began again, but bigger, brighter, and with one new addition. Projected against his garage door, visible to everyone on the street, was a massive message. Security cameras in use. Smile, you're on camera. The neighbors chuckled when they saw it, assuming it was just a precaution against vandals. But Daniel knew it was more than that. It was a quiet warning, meant for one person. Karen froze when she saw the message through her window. Her stomach dropped, and for the first time, she felt genuine fear. Had he seen her? Did he know? The thought gnawed at her all evening. Then, the next morning, her worst fears came true. An anonymous email appeared in her inbox. No subject line, no text, just a single attachment. A still image from Daniel's camera footage showing her crouched beside his electrical outlet, flashlight in hand, mid-sabotage. Karen's hands trembled. Her chest tightened. She knew immediately what it meant. She had been caught. Daniel didn't spread the photo. He didn't post it online or show it to neighbors. But the silent knowledge of what he could do terrified Karen more than any public exposure. She was trapped in her own paranoia, waiting for the fallout that never came. Days passed, and the light show continued, brighter, louder, and now more popular than ever. News crews came again, this time interviewing Daniel about overcoming neighborhood challenges and standing up for community spirit. He spoke calmly, never naming names, always focusing on unity. Karen couldn't stand it. Every word felt like a dagger. Every headline made her heart race. She avoided leaving her house altogether, peeking through blinds as streams of visitors passed by, unaware of the secret she carried. Christmas Eve arrived, and Maplewood glowed brighter than ever before. The light show had grown into a small festival. Food trucks lined the streets, children waved sparklers, and a local choir performed under Daniel's sparkling canopy. The donation box had raised thousands for charity. And yet, in one dark window across the street, Karen watched from the shadows, the only person not smiling, not celebrating. What she didn't realize was that her story wasn't finished. Daniel still had one final surprise in store, not to humiliate her, but to teach her a lesson she would never forget. By Christmas Eve morning, Maplewood Estates had become a small-town phenomenon. News vans lined the main street. Local vendors sold cocoa to the steady stream of visitors, and the once quiet cul-de-sac buzzed with laughter and excitement. Daniel's house stood at the heart of it all, a radiant beacon crowned with synchronized lights and glowing decorations that danced to carols played through the FM station. The story of the man who defied the HOA had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Social media clips of the show had reached tens of thousands of views, each one praising the spirit of community Daniel had inspired. Families from nearby towns came to see it, and the local paper even ran a headline that read, "The House That Saved Christmas Spirit." Daniel's driveway overflowed with wrapped gifts and donations for the shelter fund. Every night, he stood at the edge of his lawn, quietly greeting families, helping them find parking, and thanking them for contributing. He never once mentioned Karen or the conflict. To everyone else, this was simply a story about joy and generosity. But to Karen, trapped behind her tightly drawn curtains, it was torture. The laughter outside felt like mockery. The lights that shimmered across her windows made her home feel smaller, darker, colder. She couldn't escape the glow, no matter how many times she turned off her lamps or pulled the blinds tighter. The noise, the cheer, the music, it all felt like it was directed at her. For weeks, she had lived in fear, waiting for Daniel to expose her. The image he'd sent, the one showing her crouched beside his outlet, haunted her every night. She imagined it going viral, neighbors whispering behind her back, the HOA stripping her of her position. But nothing happened. Daniel never shared it. That silence gnawed at her more than public shame ever could. As the afternoon sun began to set on Christmas Eve, Daniel made one last round of preparations for the night's grand finale. He'd planned something special, a display unlike anything before, one that would light up not just his home, but the entire block. For the past week, he had quietly worked with several neighbors who volunteered to participate, stringing lights across driveways, rooftops, and trees. When the sun dipped below the horizon, every house on Maplewood Estates began to glow, not just Daniel's. The lights were linked, programmed to move in perfect harmony to the same music broadcast through his transmitter. It was breathtaking. The whole street pulsed with red, green, and gold. Karen's jaw dropped when she looked out. Her once perfectly neutral neighborhood had turned into a symphony of color. Even the homes of residents who had once been afraid to decorate now shone proudly. One by one, families stepped outside to watch, clapping and cheering as the synchronized show began. Daniel stood in his driveway, smiling faintly as the first song played. He had spent weeks perfecting the sequence, a medley of Christmas classics ending with a message projected in white light across the houses. Merry Christmas, Maplewood, together we shine. The crowd cheered. Children danced. Strangers embraced. And for a moment, the neighborhood was united in pure joy. But Daniel wasn't done. As the applause faded and the next song began, the projection shifted. Across the garage door, a short video began to play. A montage of photos and clips showing the progress of the light show from the first night to now. Smiling faces, donations being dropped off, neighbors helping one another string up decorations. It was a highlight reel of everything the community had achieved together. And then, near the end, one image appeared that made everyone fall silent. It was a close-up of Daniel's security camera footage from that night, the night the lights had gone out. It showed a shadowy figure crouched near his outlet, her face faintly illuminated by the flashlight. It wasn't zoomed in, not clear enough for the average viewer to identify, but for those who knew, it was unmistakable. Karen froze. Her heart pounded. Her hands went cold. Daniel had done something brilliant. He hadn't exposed her name, but he had shown enough for her to recognize herself. The image faded quickly, replaced by a simple message. Forgiveness is the brightest light of all. Then the lights surged brighter than ever before, the final song erupting in a wave of color and sound that filled the entire neighborhood. The message wasn't cruel. It was kind, almost painfully so. It didn't humiliate her. It offered her a way out. Karen felt her chest tighten. The shame hit her harder than she expected. She watched from behind her curtains as the people she had scolded, fined, and intimidated for years stood shoulder to shoulder, celebrating something she had tried to destroy. And then something inside her broke, but not in anger this time. In regret. For the first time in years, Karen stepped outside. She moved slowly, almost afraid, the crisp winter air biting at her skin. The sound of laughter and music surrounded her. Neighbors turned, surprised to see her. A few waved hesitantly. Karen didn't speak. She just stood at the edge of her driveway, staring at the glow that reflected in her eyes. And though no one could hear it, she whispered a quiet thank you. Daniel noticed her from across the street. He didn't say a word either, but he nodded once, an unspoken gesture of peace. The crowd continued celebrating, and for the first time in years, Karen didn't feel like the villain of her own story. She simply stood there, watching the lights she had once tried to destroy shine brighter than ever. As the night went on and the final song faded into silence, Daniel switched off the lights one last time. The neighborhood erupted in applause, people cheering and hugging, unaware of the quiet reconciliation that had just taken place across the street. The next morning, when the sun rose over Maplewood, Karen did something that made everyone pause. She hung a single string of white lights along her porch, simple, elegant, and peaceful. No one said a word about it, but everyone noticed. And as Daniel watched from his kitchen window, he couldn't help but smile. He hadn't just won against the HOA. He had changed it. But while the holidays ended in peace, the aftermath of that night would carry forward into the new year, and the HOA itself would never be the same again. The morning after Christmas was unusually quiet in Maplewood Estates. The excitement of the night before lingered in the air like the fading scent of cinnamon and pine. Wrapping paper-littered driveways, the last of the cocoa stands had been packed away, and a soft frost coated the lawns. For once, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Daniel woke early, stepping onto his porch with a mug of coffee in hand. The scene before him was something he hadn't seen since moving in. Calm smiles, friendly waves, genuine warmth between neighbors who had spent months divided by petty rules and fear. The light show had ended, but its impact hadn't. Across the street, Karen's porch glowed faintly with her new string of white lights. They were simple and understated, but to Daniel, they meant everything. That one gesture was louder than any apology could have been. He didn't need her to say the words. Her actions had said enough. Still, the fallout from the past few weeks had only just begun. The HOA board, embarrassed by the public attention and the viral news coverage, had called for an emergency review of its bylaws. Dozens of residents attended, some for the first time ever. What had once been a small, tight-knit group of rule enforcers suddenly found itself under scrutiny from a neighborhood that had finally found its voice. Karen arrived at that meeting late. The room went silent when she walked in. For years, she had been the face of the HOA, unyielding, meticulous, and intimidating. But this time, there was no clipboard in her hand, no stack of violation notices, just a quiet woman holding a small notebook and a tired expression. As the board discussed changes, relaxing decoration rules, revising fine structures, and allowing more homeowner freedom, Karen sat silently in the corner, listening. When it came time for public comments, a few residents stood to thank Daniel for his efforts and for reminding everyone what community should mean. Then, unexpectedly, Karen raised her hand. The room froze. In a soft, measured tone, she admitted that the HOA had lost sight of what it was meant to do. She confessed to overstepping, to letting personal grievances influence her actions. And though she never mentioned Daniel's name directly, everyone knew. She ended her statement by proposing a new rule, one that encouraged positive recognition instead of punishment. Applause filled the room. Even the board members who had once feared her nodded in approval. It wasn't redemption in the grand sense. It was quieter than that, but it was real. Over the following weeks, Maplewood Estates transformed. The HOA's reputation shifted from rigid to reasonable. Instead of fines for minor infractions, the board introduced community rewards, small acknowledgments for acts of kindness, home improvements, or neighborhood contributions. Daniel's holiday charity project became an annual event, with different families taking turns hosting. Karen gradually stepped back from the board. At first, it was temporary, a leave of absence. Then, quietly, she chose not to return at all. She still lived across the street from Daniel, but the tension between them dissolved into something almost like friendship. She began waving to him each morning, sometimes even stopping to chat briefly about the weather or the state of her garden. The rest of the neighborhood noticed, and something subtle changed. People began talking more, helping one another, and letting go of the old habit of tattling over trivial things. The rulebook still existed, but it no longer defined the community. Months passed. Winter turned to spring. The remnants of the light show were carefully packed away in Daniel's garage, ready for next year. Life returned to its usual rhythm. but with a new sense of warmth. Then, one morning in early April, Daniel found a small envelope on his doorstep. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, neatly written, no signature, just a few words. "Thank you for not embarrassing me when you could have. I was wrong, and you showed me a better way to be right." He didn't need to guess who it was from. Daniel tucked the note away, feeling an unexpected wave of peace. The war with the HOA had ended not through revenge, but through restraint, and that, he realized, was the real victory. By summer, the story of Maplewood's Christmas miracle had faded from local headlines, replaced by new news and new distractions. But for those who lived there, the change remained. The light show had been more than decoration. It had been a reset button for an entire community. And though Daniel never intended to become a symbol, that's what he became. Neighbors who once barely spoke now shared weekend barbecues. Kids who used to play separately now filled the streets together. And every time someone mentioned the HOA, it was met not with eye rolls, but quiet laughter at how far they'd come. Karen rarely spoke of the incident, but she showed her growth in small ways. She joined a local volunteer group, started attending neighborhood potlucks, and even donated to the next holiday display fund. The woman who once fined people for unauthorized joy had finally found some of her own. But as December approached again, everyone began asking the same question. Would Daniel do it again? Would the famous light show return for another year? Daniel wasn't sure, at least not yet. He wanted to make sure that if he did, it wasn't about proving a point this time. It would be about celebration, togetherness, and light in its purest form. By the time the next December rolled around, Maplewood Estates was no longer the quiet, rule-bound neighborhood it had once been. The lawns were still neat, the streets still calm, but there was laughter now. Decorations went up earlier that year, and for the first time in HOA history, no one sent out warning letters about aesthetic uniformity or unauthorized decor. The spirit that had begun with one man's defiance had spread like light itself. Daniel stood in his garage one chilly afternoon, staring at the rows of neatly labeled boxes stacked against the wall. Each one was filled with the equipment that had once caused so much chaos. Hundreds of strands of LEDs, controllers, sequencers, projectors, and the old FM transmitter that had carried his music through the night. He hadn't touched them since last winter. Part of him wondered if it was time to move on. The show had started as an act of resistance, a way to push back against unfairness. But now, there was no one left to fight. The neighborhood was happy, cooperative, at peace. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the lights still had one more story to tell. That week, flyers began appearing on doorsteps, simple sheets of paper with bold red letters that read, "Maplewood Lights Returns, a night to remember. December 23rd, 7 p.m. At the bottom, it said, "Hosted by the community, for the community." This time, it wasn't Daniel's project alone. It was everyone's. Families volunteered to decorate their houses. Kids designed the music playlist, and even the HOA board pitched in to provide hot chocolate and parking attendance. And then, something remarkable happened. Karen volunteered too. When she showed up at Daniel's door holding a small box of lights, there was an awkward pause at first, a silence filled with everything unsaid. But Daniel simply smiled and stepped aside, motioning toward the yard. She joined him in stringing the lights, careful and quiet, and by the end of the afternoon, the tension that once defined their relationship had melted away completely. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Maplewood Estates came alive once more. The new show wasn't as grand as the one from the year before. It was softer, simpler, and deeply human. Instead of blinding displays of color, it focused on warmth, soft golden lights, flickering lanterns, and synchronized candles placed along every driveway. The entire street glowed in unison, not from spectacle, but from shared effort. At the center of it all stood Daniel's house, beautiful but modest this time, draped in soft white lights that shimmered gently like falling snow. And there, at the edge of his lawn, stood the new sign. "Together, we shine brighter." The crowd that gathered was even larger than the year before. Families came not to gawk, but to participate. There were carolers, food stands, and donation boxes for local shelters. News crews returned too, though their stories this year had a different tone. They spoke not of conflict or defiance, but of transformation, of a community reborn. When the clock struck 7, the show began. Music filled the air, lights twinkled in rhythm, and laughter rippled down the street. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now sang together. Children darted between lawns, waving glow sticks, while parents shared smiles that said more than words ever could. And then came the moment that made the entire night unforgettable. Karen stepped forward, holding a microphone. The crowd hushed. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. She thanked everyone for helping turn Maplewood into what it had become, a neighborhood built not on fear or rules, but on kindness and unity. Then she looked toward Daniel and said, with genuine warmth, that none of it would have happened without him. It wasn't a speech rehearsed for the cameras. It was raw and sincere. For the first time, Karen looked truly human to the people she had once ruled over. And when she finished, the applause was overwhelming. Daniel didn't respond with words. Instead, he nodded to the control box beside him, and a new sequence began, one that no one had seen before. The lights across the neighborhood dimmed, then slowly brightened in waves of gold and white, forming a single phrase across multiple houses, letter by letter. Peace on earth begins at home. The crowd went silent, then erupted in cheers. It was simple, profound, perfect. Later that night, when the visitors had gone and the last of the cocoa stands had closed, Daniel stood outside alone for a moment, staring at the gentle glow of his home. Across the street, Karen's house shimmered softly with her own new decorations. Red ribbons, a small wreath, and a single strand of golden lights running along her roofline. It wasn't much, but it was beautiful. As snow began to fall, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt since before moving to Maplewood: contentment. The war that had started with fines, threats, and pettiness had ended in friendship, forgiveness, and light. He looked around at the neighborhood he had once thought of leaving and realized he never wanted to. Maplewood wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was alive. And that night, as the lights flickered softly against the dark sky, it felt like the whole world was at peace. The next morning, Karen left a small card on Daniel's porch. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Merry Christmas, Daniel. Thank you for helping me find the light." He smiled, slipped the card into his pocket, and looked out over the quiet street blanketed in snow. The Battle of Maplewood was long over. The lesson, though, would live on forever.